Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us, all of you in the room here and all of you online. This is our very first seminar on public policy and philanthropy. It is the first in what will be a series of conversations. And thank you all for joining us here in person at the Skyline Club and also online. The purpose of this series is to advance the understanding of the vital connections between philanthropy and policy. To this end, we are convening a series of interviews with leaders who can help illuminate how philanthropy can inform and influence key areas of policy that affect human well-being, and the ways in which policy shapes the strategies that are available to philanthropy as it pursues the public good. The purpose of these conversations is to inform a research agenda that will advance understanding of how philanthropy can engage policy usefully, and also what kinds of policy architectures are most conducive to the kinds of philanthropy that foster a vibrant civil society. Thank you so much for joining us. And we are very fortunate to have with us Melissa Berman. We are also thrilled to be joined in this conversation on policy with Diane Kaplan, former longtime president of the Rasmussen Foundation, Alaska's largest. She is currently serving as senior fellow at the school. During her 27-year tenure as president of the Rasmussen Foundation, it grew from 5 million to 800 million in assets, and she was a pioneer in its work with Indigenous organizations connected to policy outreach. At our school, as senior fellow, Diane is distilling some broadly applicable lessons from her leadership in philanthropy and is helping us develop this series of convenings on philanthropy and policy. She is already a familiar colleague to our faculty and students, so let me offer a few words of introduction for Melissa. For those who may not know her background, from 2002 to 2024, Melissa was the founding president and CEO of Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, an innovative nonprofit philanthropy service launched by the Rockefeller family. Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors' mission is to accelerate philanthropy in pursuit of a just world. Melissa built RPA, as it is called, into one of the world's leading philanthropic advisory, grant-making, research, and project management services, facilitating more than $500 million a year across a dozen countries in all major issue areas. A frequent speaker, Melissa has been a guest lecturer at universities across the US, Europe, Latin America, and Asia. As a widely recognized expert in philanthropy, Melissa has been profiled and interviewed in major media. An adjunct professor at Columbia University's Business School, Melissa is also a director or trustee of Candid, Equality Now, and the Adrian Brinkerhoff Poetry Foundation. In 2023, she had the burden of being a fellow at the Bellagio Center. It's a wonderful place for those of you who haven't heard of it. She holds a BA from Harvard University and a PhD from Stanford. So we'll begin by asking Melissa and Diane to briefly share their impressions of the state of connection between philanthropy and policy. We will ask Melissa to kick us off with something of a more global orientation. Melissa.
Thank you, Amir. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you. When I think about the relationship between philanthropy and policy, I know that we all tend to think about policy as creating the enabling environment for any number of things, including philanthropy. But I also think that culture and issues of social dynamics help create the enabling environment that results in policy. So it isn't just a one-way street. So that's how I think about the relationship between policy and philanthropy. I think of philanthropy as sitting between society with its norms and values, and policy as a reflection often, but not always, of society and its values. So I think that in terms of global trends, the global scene is, shall we say, a pretty active, complicated, challenging one right now. I think as it affects philanthropy in particular, there are both opportunities and challenges. So the challenges are that in many places in the world, philanthropy is under a lot of pressure from the public sector. There's a tightening of the scope of what philanthropy can support, what the range of nonprofit and charitable activities can be, restrictions on funding coming from outside a country. And those trends are not good for our sector, right? and they're probably not good for our vision of the world that we want to see. I think a second trend, a little bit outside policy itself, is that we have a lot of challenges to trust, credibility, and legitimacy across the philanthropic sector. People who don't understand what charitable organizations do, people who feel that private donors should not have a role in being able to be such big players on the philanthropic scene. Distrust and polarization hit us in philanthropy also. And that atmosphere creates a lot of bad policy, right? The opportunities, though, do make me very optimistic. One is that a global culture of giving, to some extent, is spreading around the world, and a greater interest in not only donating, but in various types of social investment is making ever more resources available to bring about social and environmental change. That's a very good trend. And as that trend continues, I'm hopeful that it leads to better policies. Second, I think that many donors now, as well as social investors and impact investors, are much more serious about their philanthropy. They are not content to be generous. They want to be knowledgeable. They want to be able to be spokespeople for the issues and the causes and the organizations that they care about. That brings a much deeper level of engagement than we've seen before, a much deeper understanding of things like systems change, the idea, if not the practice, of trust-based philanthropy. And that too can help create a more positive, enabling policy environment. So those are the things that I'm optimistic about.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Wonderful way to kick us off. Let's turn to Diane now to talk a little bit about her experience with advocacy and leveraging government and her experience.
Rasmussen Foundation is the only large foundation in Alaska. And when I began with it, it was very, very tiny. As you heard from Amir, $5–6 million in assets. We distributed about $300,000 a year. So with that, it was necessary to find ways to have an impact without having millions of dollars to give, or even hundreds of thousands of dollars to give. And that's really where we started in that era. Ed Rasmussen, the guy I worked with for 27 years, and really the subject of the work that I'm doing here at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, writing the story of the two of us and how we worked together for 27 years to do things. He had a big R on his chest. There was no doubt that he was a Republican. The family name Rasmussen is a Republican name in Alaska. And I didn't have a big D on me because I had worked in the news business before that. I was always an independent, though at various times, for good reasons, I was a Republican for a couple of months, Democrat for a few months to vote for somebody for something. But I had, in between my work at public radio and with the foundation, I'd run a consulting company. And one of the things I did was lobby. So I lobbied at the federal level, I lobbied at the state level, the city level for clients that were close to me, public radio, Native organizations, tribes, nonprofits, and so on. So I loved it. I liked the excitement of seeing how legislation was made. There was just a high about being around the state capitol, the city hall chambers, and learning about tribes and their role in Alaska, which is very different than in the lower 48. And also going to Capitol Hill and meeting with legislators, with members of Congress. We only have 3. We have more senators than our one House member, which only a couple of states are in that. And we're a very small place, so we know our legislators. My mom, who lives in New York, who comes once a year to Alaska, knew our entire congressional delegation just with her times being there. So, but if you sat at the Rasmussen board table, you would hear a board member who actually served in the Connecticut legislature herself say, "We don't do advocacy." And everyone would say, "We do not do advocacy." They didn't call it advocacy. They did it in their sleep, though. It was the dinner where they'd run into the mayor and say, by the way, or it was the golf game where they'd be playing with the congressman. And they said it's always about on the 15th hole that start getting edgy. Am I going to get my thing out that I want to do? Or in the dentist seat where, you're lying back and the dentist says something about some oral health thing you're doing. So what we realized, given we didn't have other peer philanthropic partners, the corporations came and went. They had very different roles and missions than we did. We had to work with government to get anything done, whether it was housing, the big money is government. If it's healthcare, it's government. And I don't care if you're the Gates Foundation, it's still government. When you look at the size of dollars going in to solve big problems. So to me, the biggest failure of philanthropy as an industry is not using its greatest tool, which is its influence, in a way to advance the public good in a way that it could. Most private foundations are fearful of the word advocacy. They don't do it. They don't think they're allowed to do it. They think it's illegal to do it, and they stay away from it. And they even put in their grant agreements that their grantees can't do it either, even they don't have to. So I think one of the things we want to do is highlight foundations that have learned, in fact, you absolutely can do advocacy. There are certainly rules for foundations around how you do that, but also that you must, if you are serious about being involved in systems change in our world. And it doesn't matter if it's in culture, it doesn't matter if it's in civic engagement, if it's in the environment, whatever area you're in, there are always going to be policy road bumps that you gotta be able to solve if you're gonna achieve what you're trying to do.
Well, thank you so much for highlighting the importance of the government in terms of any issue that you're interested in. There's always going to be a policy context within
Yes.
which that happens. So let's turn to Melissa and ask her when she was at Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, advising pretty significant donors or foundations. How did you help them engage that intersection between philanthropy and policy? And give us maybe some examples if you can.
Sure. So I think that many private donors in particular have an aversion to the policy world. For some people who have spent most of their working years in the private sector, especially in the US, they see the public sector as those people who are trying to make their lives difficult. They see the public sector as slow moving, unresponsive, et cetera, et cetera. And so they don't want any part of it. And I think for us as philanthropy advisors, part of what worked out well in many cases was helping donors gain experience with some of the kinds of major initiatives that they were just getting going with, and then having them turn around and say, for example, without a policy change, all this money is just going nowhere. So an example is a couple, they wanted to do a lot in climate change, and the husband's point of view was, this is going to be solved by technology and, mirrors in space and this kind of, et cetera, et cetera. And he pursued some of those ideas. And then a few years later, he suddenly turns to us and says, if there isn't a real full price for carbon, none of this matters. And we go, oh, you're right. Good point. Right. So there is that. For other people in philanthropy, they don't want to get engaged. They're not going to get engaged. They shouldn't have to get engaged. From our perspective, what's helpful is for them to be aware of what the dynamics are and be able to be in dialogue with and join coalitions that include the people who are doing the policy work, so that they are side by side with them, even if that's not what they're doing. So one of the donors we worked with, big advocate for nursing in America, nursing education, creating more PhDs in nursing so that there's more nursing faculty, because that's the bottleneck. And we would talk to him about policy and he would say, I'm 82 years old. I don't have time. This is a long game. But he supported organizations that did the policy work. He invited policy people to the convenings of some of the programs that his fund enabled, some of the scholars and deans of nursing, et cetera. So he wasn't doing policy work, but he was helping those connections become real and give them some momentum.
Thank you so much. So are there, the reluctance is something both you and Diane have talked about. Are there any kind of wrong-headed kind of rushes into effect policy that can be counterproductive and not very useful? Do either of you have examples of that?
How much time do we have?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So one of the worst train wrecks that a donor that I know got involved in, this is before we were called in. We were called in when the donor finally went. No, actually, this is a train wreck. This donor asked a family friend who had been in the public sector, where's the area of greatest need? And so this person pointed to a country in the developing world and said, this is the country where there's the greatest need. It's a post-conflict region. And he just sort of went in innocently, having never built a school or a clinic or a road or any of those kinds of things, and said to the government, hi, I'm here to help you. So millions of years later, millions of dollars later, began to understand if you want to do those kinds of programs, you need a level of infrastructure, experience on the ground, local understanding, goodwill, and decision-making, et cetera, none of which he had, and frankly, none of which he was interested in. And he exited and he put money into global scholarship programs because he could put money into the hands of organizations like an Indiana University and things like that who knew how to do it, and he didn't have to have this big infrastructure and risk. So is that a good outcome or a bad outcome? At least he's not doing harm, right? So.
Well, of course, we can all talk about probably the biggest boondoggle because we didn't do it, right?
Yes, exactly.
You know, the Gates Foundation sending computers to the Navajo reservation, places that had no electricity. And I think it took like 6 months for someone to get up the nerve to actually call and say, by the way, we had a similar thing in Alaska. We had fire trucks all over and no source of water but people like having the fire engine. I guess we had to come up with another kind of thing. So usually these are well-meaning actions. It's very rare that someone would do something like that. And I think Melissa is right. You just have a little context if you're going to get into this. And not everyone does when they start making grants. And eventually you will always hear, I had no idea how hard it is to do philanthropy. Much harder than I thought. Because you don't want to.
We had the same thing in New York City. Somebody gave, sometime in the 1980s, New York schools a whole bunch of personal computers. And, you know, they plugged them in and, you know, fires started because none of the wiring was up to code for any of this kind of stuff. And who knew that? Lots of people knew that. Not the donor, though.
So sometimes there are very expensive lessons that are learned in this process,
Yeah.
it sounds like, well. So beyond being cognizant of kind of the rules and regulations that govern the environment in which philanthropy tries to make a difference, there's also the possibility of programmatic collaboration, actually getting things done alongside governments at different levels. Diane, you've had some success with that in Alaska. Maybe you can give us some flavor of how that works, and then we can pass it to Melissa to answer the similar question.
There is a very, very little known section of IRS rules around private philanthropy. It's called the exemption for co-funding with government. So foundations know they are allowed to lobby for self-defense. So let's say you're a foundation and the state of Montana is going to pass a bill that would cause you to have to pay more taxes or something like that. You are allowed to defend yourself and lobby for that. But there's a second one called the co-funding exemption. As far as I know, the Rasmussen Foundation is the only foundation in the United States who uses the co-funding exemption. And I have sent the legal ruling to at least 30, 40 other CEOs who immediately take it to their general counsel, who says, well, there's really no case law on this. I don't think we should be the ones to try it. You know, we're too much in the bullseye. What it means is if you fund something with government, you are allowed to lobby on it. So if you are a funder of childcare centers and you've made a grant, a challenge grant, and you have grantees who are trying to get matching money, government money, discretionary money, you absolutely are allowed to speak to that legislator and say, we're giving a grant, we will match this if you do it, and so on. You can't do grassroots lobbying. You can't go on the air and say, vote for this. You can't do it for a candidate or something like that. But where you are co-funding, you are absolutely entitled to do it, but people are afraid to do it. I remember meeting a young woman from West Virginia, when Robert Byrd was the House Finance Chair for the US Congress, and they were trying to get some funding for community foundation, some other thing, really good stuff. And I said, how often do you visit Senator Byrd, Senate Finance, sorry. And she said, you know, we don't, why? And I said, because I would take every penny you've got and buy plane tickets, because all of these things you're talking about are getting funded in other places, and no one is better positioned than you are. And that was in the age of earmarks. Now they're kind of back with a congressionally designated grants, CDGs. But every senator can do them. And almost nobody really plays that. And they're either afraid to, they don't know they can, they've been misadvised, and so on. And another example, in Alaska, we had something called, that many of you probably have in whatever state you are from or live in, called the Children's Trust, Alaska Children's Trust. There was a period of time in the 70s where many, many states or cities formed a children's trust focused on prevention of child abuse and neglect, because most child abuse agencies are focused on dealing with victims, not on prevention. So the idea was to dedicate funds for prevention. Most of them were at states, not all of them. The one we had in Alaska failed to thrive. And the reason was, who wants to write a check to the state of Alaska? Nobody, I can tell you. So it never grew. It started with some money from a legal settlement, and then it sat there and it never grew. Donors never got a thank you note. They never got asked for a donation again. The people on the board never even knew who donated to say thank you if they saw them. There was no stewardship from the government of these philanthropic charitable gifts. So we decided we need to, plus the investments were terrible too, the return, investment return. So we sought to, a couple new board members, let's get this thing out of the government, let's privatize it. And we thought, oh, that'll be easy. Well, it took about 4 years or so, because every possible, you know, the people who got it in the first place are attached to it. Other people saying, who are you to tell us, you know, what to do? Don't tell me our state can't handle this thing, whatever it would be. But it took the R, the big R and the almost a D, working together to get enough legislators to think, well, if Republicans think it's okay, Democrats think it's okay, the governor thinks it's okay, who is my Ed's hunting partner, I guess it's okay. And having that cross the aisle support was key, and always is key. And for our state, it's been, actually, we'd be nowhere where we are in terms of infrastructure without the bipartisanship. When Senator Stevens was the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, when the Republicans were in charge, he took care of Hawaii. When Senator Inouye was in charge, when the Democrats were in charge of the Senate, he took care of Alaska. That's how they did it. They were World War II pilots together. They loved each other like brothers. They understood what it was like to be those last two states who missed out on a lot of the infrastructure. And that's what they did. And then as soon as it was out of the government, now it's, I don't know, 15 million, something like that. So very quickly became very adept at raising funds. It's a great cause to raise funds for. Donors love the organization because they're treated so well and so on. Another time, each Alaskan gets something called the permanent fund dividend. Do people know what that is? It's our share of the oil wealth every year. So I'll get a check for, I don't know, they're fighting about it right now, somewhere between $1,000 and $2,000 this year, just for living in Alaska. And we did a bill called Pick, Click, Give to allow you to donate all or part of that to any charity you want. Well, people had tried before, but they'd want to do it for education. And then I'd come along and say, let's add public radio on. And someone would say, let's add the arts on. And then it would become a Christmas tree and it would fall over under its own weight because everybody wanted their own cause. So we just made it for everyone. If you qualify as a charity, fine. Then everybody could get what they wanted. And again, it took years and a lot of work and a lot of going down to the state capitol and a lot of phone calls and a lot of tears, believe me, you know, when the session ran out, but worth it, absolutely worth it. And now it's a few $1,000,000 every year of unrestricted money, and a lot of the little small organizations exist on it. You know, the ones who have the $80,000 budget to get you your cat when you want to adopt a cat, the two cat ladies and mine, $80,000 budget, 60,000 from Pick, Click, Give. So yeah, it's worth it.
So you have seen changes going on, and you mentioned the polarization right now. So it's kind of palpable. It's changing the way what we think is possible. Obviously, there's polarized attitudes toward what the role of philanthropy should be, but obviously it's also affecting how you can engage in policy as a philanthropist. What are you seeing in our current environment of polarization, and how is it affecting this relationship between policy and philanthropy?
Yeah, that's a very interesting, complicated question. I think that for many donors, both individuals who are prominent, as well as large foundations, they're starting to see some opportunities to participate in funding collaboratives. And that helps deal with some of the polarization issues because it doesn't personalize the campaign in the name of one single individual or one single foundation. So it helps deal with some of the legitimacy and questions. Those funder collaboratives are often under the aegis of a public charity versus a private foundation. That gives people more of a sense that there's accountability and that there's a process that has to be followed. And for many people who participate in these funder collaboratives, the compromises that they need to make are worth it because of the progress that they ultimately get to. Not everybody likes being part of a funder collaborative. One foundation CEO said to me once, a donor collaborative is just the lowest common denominator because that's all we can agree on. And that is one point of view. But it's also true that if you can pull together as disparate a group as possible, with everybody remaining authentic to their own views, you may weaken your individual set of talking points a little bit and only get 3 out of the 5, but you can make a lot more progress that way. We've seen things like the new Pluralist Fund, which involves organizations that are funded by the Koch network and organizations that are funded by Open Society foundations. And a whole lot from other points of view, et cetera, slowly starting to work on issues that bring us back to what are shared values, what do we have in common, things like that. They're not quick, easy wins, right? But they offer a real way to help us deal with polarization, I feel.
Let's ask Dan to comment on the same issue of polarization.
In the role I had for a couple of decades, I really had to work with everybody because politicians come and go. Mayor may have a 3-year term, a governor may have a 4-year term, a senator may have a 6-year term, but their vision is only as long as the term that they're in. So if you are not going to interest a mayor in something that takes 6 years to do, I'm sorry, I hate to say it, it's just true. They're looking at a 3-year, if it's a 3-year term, that's their horizon. And you also don't want to try and force your agenda on a politician because they all have just run for an office. They've been elected by the populace because there are things with whatever they said that appealed to the people who voted for them. That's their agenda. And the key, I think, to being successful is to really look at where you have alignment with what the politician wants to do. And it can be very different things, but almost everybody can find some alignment. And that, I think, is the key, because it'll, first of all, I would say most people in most places consider philanthropies to be towards the left, even though I'm not sure that that's true if you even, did an actual study on it, whether that would be true at all. But there's that perception, certainly among the larger ones. Might be, so you might be perceived as maybe not, you wouldn't have similar things. But usually you're going to find some place you can agree. It could be building housing. It could be childcare. It could be youth athletics. It could be parks. It could be trails. It could be transportation. But if you can find where you have a link and where you share a vision, you can work together. And we worked with people, members of Congress, tribal leaders, mayors, and people do all around the country. And I'll tell you, if there's a great example, it's the Lilly Endowment. I mean, you read, just having started following it, all the times when you see some of the great initiatives, government is involved most of the time because they're big plays and they take cooperation. Often the foundation can bring things to the table the government doesn't have. They can convene people better. They can do research better. They don't have the limitation of the term of office. They can go a little longer, those kinds of things. So I think each can bring benefits to the other that just make it smart to work together. And I think the smart politicians and the smart foundations figure that out.
I think there's a lot of local examples of very generative public-private partnerships where philanthropy plays an interesting catalytic role as well. But both of you have also played leadership roles at national infrastructure associations that seek to nurture the well-being of philanthropy broadly, the whole infrastructure of philanthropy. And I seem to think that policymakers in general are kind of woefully uninterested or uneducated about how philanthropy in the nonprofit sector works. So given your experience in trying to support the overall infrastructure and well-being of our civic society, what are some of the reforms, maybe just one reform because our policymakers' attention span is limited. What are some of the reforms that are either positive or that you think that are some recent measures that have been damaging? But what would you recommend, if you could, to a policymaker in terms of what changes should we make to improve the chances for philanthropy to be effective?
I think it would be actually helpful for there to be an intermediate stage before we go to the policymakers. I think it would be really helpful if the philanthropic sector funded an initiative to a public education initiative to explain broadly to people what is a not-for-profit. I mean, I still have people say to me, it must be really hard to run a not-for-profit because you have to break even exactly at the end of the year, right? Or who owns your not-for-profit, right? The level of, so a public education campaign about that, a public education campaign about what the nonprofit sector contributes in this country in particular, where our nonprofit sector is enormous. We have these nonprofit universities and hospitals and this and that, right? That would help educate a lot of people. And the same kind of thing about what's a foundation. You ask Americans, name a foundation. The last time I looked at one of these surveys, the number one organization mentioned was the American Red Cross. Right? Foundation, not for profit. And who can blame them? If the Michael J. Fox Foundation is a public charity like the Red Cross, why shouldn't people be confused, right? So if we had a broader understanding of this at a social level, that would inform the people who vote for the politicians, and that would then put it on their agenda.
I think what I've felt over the years is, as an industry, if philanthropy could take advantage of all the people connected to its universe and put it to work, it could be one of the most powerful forces in the country. If you look at who sits on the board of the, how many, 40,000 foundations now, private foundations, is that the number?
No, it's well over 100.
Okay, so 100,000, someone does. So let's say 100,000 private foundations. Let's say they average, I think, about 8 to 10 board members on each one. So you've got 1 million people who sit, let's say there are a few who serve on more than one, right? Let's say conservative, 500,000 to 700,000 people who serve on a foundation board, many of whom are influential, have wealth, have connections in their community, which is what gets them on, or they're from a wealthy family, which usually are pretty well connected politically too. If you knew who all of those people were, if you had them cataloged, organized, philanthropy could do anything it wants on the national level. As far as I am aware, only one piece of legislation initiated by philanthropy has ever passed Congress in the last 4 decades. Now, those of you who are in the government lobbying world know a lot of what you do is preventing bad legislation from passing, not passing good. But also, so when you talk about what could you do, right now, nothing. I would say almost nothing, because it's just not organized in a way to be successful. Even years ago, when I worked in public radio, National Public Radio, I'm sure if you went in the government relations office, would have charts like around the wall with the center, with every board member and which member of Congress they're related to. And by snapping their fingers, could get this organization, going if there were a threat. And there was always a threat. And that's why they were prepared to do that. But philanthropy has never had those kind of threats, really. And so has never had to organize in that way. But if it did for the right reasons, it could do anything, I'm convinced. And that's, if I were to create something, it would be to put that army to work when it needed to be. And we have had times recently when we should have done that. Philanthropy got totally rolled in the tax bill, totally rolled. And we pay 3 national organizations to make sure we don't get rolled, but we did. No one even knew what was going on. So I think it's time, I really do.
I agree with that energy also.
Great. So those are 2, I think, positive possibilities for the future. And I'm going to ask my last question. So the rest of you, please get ready with your questions for our 2 wonderful speakers. You talked about possibilities, or although some of them are unlikely, you said. And I don't know if philanthropy is analogous to higher education, which seems to be in the crosshairs of some of our legislators at this time in the world, and maybe that's not the right worry. But when you look at the landscape out there, what are the, we always want things to move in a positive direction, but what is it that you worry about? What do you think are some of the dangers and the possible really bad outcomes that we might want to worry about, and at that, especially at that intersection of philanthropy and policy?
I think polarization is a clear and present danger in many, many ways. I think it leads to the possibility that nonprofit organizations in this country also would find their exemption status affected by the kind of work that they do. not to mention their point of view. I think that it might become harder for nonprofit organizations to have any voice in policy at all, because people conflate the political process with other kinds of processes of public education, and the kind of advocacy that's currently perfectly legal to do, as Diane has so clearly explained to us. So I think that tendency of looking at people who disagree with you as an enemy and as a demon that needs to be controlled is extremely, extremely dangerous.
On the same subject, we have a unique philanthropy. It's located about an hour north of where I live in Anchorage, the biggest city, place called the Matsu Borough. It's where our current governor is from. It's where Sarah Palin came from. It's the most conservative area in the state. It has a blogger called The Watchman, who takes on different issues. Right now, they're really big on library book banning and a couple of other things like that. The Matsu Health Foundation was formed when the local hospital was sold by the community to a private corporation. And you probably know it's not unusual when that happens, or when a Blue Cross becomes for-profit, to basically charge the deal for the taxes the entity didn't pay for many years and form a foundation. Often they're called conversion foundations, when you convert a hospital, convert a Blue Cross, that kind of thing. And it sets up an endowment for that community to compensate the community. So that's what the Matsu Health Foundation is. However, what makes them unique is they maintain 30% ownership in the hospital. So they are growing like crazy, because hospitals have been growing like crazy, and that one in particular. So they are now the second biggest foundation in Alaska, and I think they will be bigger than Rasmussen Foundation one day. However, they got involved in something that became a thing. There is the Palmer, which is one of their cities. The Chamber of Commerce has something called Colony Days. Back in around Depression times, the territory of Alaska tried to attract farmers from Minnesota, Wisconsin mainly, to come up and do farming in Alaska. Didn't work out so well for many of them, but they were called the colonists. And so they do Colony Days, which is basically a community festival. But for Alaskan Native people, the word colony is it's a thing. It's worrisome, and it doesn't feel good to have that name. So they approached the chamber, and the chamber decided to change the name to Winter Carnival or something like that. And it wasn't any big deal, but the Watchman found out about it and decided that it was horrible. This was a traditional name of a traditional festival. All of the members of the chamber who voted for it got thrown out in the next election. And then they found out the Matsu Health Foundation actually funded the process. And then he started targeting their CEO and the board. They were formed, unfortunately for them, as a membership organization. So what's going on right now is they just ended at the end of the month. They were flooding the foundation with new members, $10 to be a member. Anyone who's a resident can be a member, with the hope of throwing out the board and the CEO. So you could take this, it's a magnificent foundation. They do unbelievable work. They have changed, totally focused on health, mostly behavioral health, in a place that needs it. And we don't know what the outcome of the election. Both sides had to do a campaign for members. We don't know how it'll come out, how it'll play out. But this would have been unheard of a year ago, I would say. So these are the kind of things where a foundation is viewed as too important, too big, too powerful, too influential, and not doing what I would want to do if I had that money.
Wonderful comments. Up to you now. I have many more questions on related topics, but this is your opportunity, both in the room and online, to engage our two wonderful speakers. Tony, just.
Thanks so much for everything tonight. As you know, there's an emerging court case that could potentially overturn the Johnson Amendment, which has prevented 501c3 nonprofits from engaging in electioneering and endorsing candidates. I'm curious to get your take on what you think that could mean for 501c3s and trust that Americans have them if the Johnson Amendment is overturned.
Go first.
Let me try not to answer that question. Um, I think that there's a significant danger that while it gives 501c organizations a kind of almost First Amendment right that logically you would think they ought to be entitled to, this is really not the right time for that. On the other hand, I do feel that the logic of a charitable organization not to be able to engage in certain kinds of speech when we have opened up elections to anybody who has a buck doesn't make a lot of sense. So the way I'd like to weasel out of that question is to say that I would really love to see this country move toward a place where elections are publicly funded, which would take a lot of this tension off the table. Because it isn't the endorsement, it's the money.
I don't know. I don't have anything to add to that, really. I'm satisfied with how it is right now. Just because it would create a great deal of uncertainty at organizations, probably division at a time that I wouldn't like to see that.
I'm Ahmed from the Philly program, and thank you so much. It's really amazing to listen to all of you. I have a very quick comment and then questions. The comment is about lack of understanding of the landscape in developing countries.
Yes.
Many times actually, we have philanthropists who have really well-intentioned, but they are trying to build a snowman in the Sahara Desert.
Yes, they are.
Where the temperature is about 100
Yes,
degrees,
they
right? So thank you so much for mentioning that. And honestly, it is costing philanthropy a lot of money
Yes.
that could have actually contributed into a lot of preventive programs. The question I have, and Amir mentioned, talked a lot about polarization in philanthropic world and also in politics. I want to take you to the global stage, the conflict that is going on between Israel and Palestine. I have been asking, what role can philanthropy play in addressing, in supporting humanity, and not necessarily taking a side. I'll give you an example. Walmart gave, I think, $1 million to Israeli Red Cross. As soon as Walmart gave that money, a lot of people in the Muslim community now started talking about boycotting Walmart, which honestly, I'm not in support of it. We talked to the leadership of Walmart, and they graciously gave another $1 million to Gaza.
Yeah.
Which honestly, I thought it's a really great way to create balance.
Yes, I
agree. I'm not saying you have to be like an ice cream seller, please everyone, but at least that was, I think, an acceptable approach. What advice do you have for us as students of philanthropy? How can we approach major conflicts in a world that is so polarized, where we can have a voice that represents philanthropy truly?
We need you to repeat the questions so the people online can hear this.
Oh, great. So the question in sum was really how philanthropy can play a constructive role in some of the most devastating and divisive conflicts of our time internationally.
I think in this particular situation, you mentioned Israel, Gaza specifically. That is one of the most complex, right? And I'm on the board of a women's rights organization, a global women's rights organization called Equality Now, which works on legal strategies in countries around the world to give women land rights, reproductive freedom, inheritance rights, all of these kinds of things. And I would say that the board of this organization is not in a good place right now and not able to handle in some ways the differing points of view of a global board of that includes people from Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and the US and Latin America. So I feel that philanthropy has a tremendous opportunity as part of dealing with polarization and other things like that to support, for example, journalism and to help all of us around the world get a better understanding of what is real, and that we collectively allowed the field of journalism to flounder, right, when the advertising model for print failed. And that we need to, that is one very powerful thing that philanthropy could do in these situations.
Wonderful segue. You can maybe talk a little bit about what's happening in journalism to try to revive it.
Oh, sure. And I'm glad that you raised that question because, as Melissa said, it is so difficult. I was just going to add, if you think back even historically, the only entities that seem to be able to help in these situations are where you've got someone, something that has a trusting relationship with both sides of the conflict. And I think that's hard to find in this case because people have chosen sides so much, and maybe maybe that will emerge, but at this point, I don't know who you, within philanthropy, that you could point to that has enough in the way of personal relationship, which you would really need to have to be able to be an honest broker in this situation. Very, very tough. In terms of journalism, we just did a local launch of an effort called Press Forward, which is initiated by the MacArthur Foundation, not too far from here, John Palfrey, their leader, along with the Knight Foundation and others, looking at the fact that our democracy, in fact, is in urgent need of a new business, of a new, well, democracy is endangered by the fact that so many Americans now, and other people around the world, but this is particularly focused on the US, have no access to local news anymore. 20% of the American public live in a place with no local news right now. And democracies depend on citizens who are informed of issues. So if you have no local news, how do you get informed? So regardless of what area philanthropy funds in, the thought is saving local news or even enhancing it at this point has to be part of your agenda if you want to make change. It's a tough one because the new business models are not real clear. I know that if you go into any journalism class right now at any university and you hold up the newspaper and say, how many of you get this in the morning, you'd be hard pressed to find one single student among those journalism students who gets the local newspaper. So even John Palfrey was saying he was talking to a university class and asked how many of them actually pay a subscription. And almost everybody was cheating to get through a firewall using somebody else's, ID. Same thing for, other things. Yet they're paying for Netflix. They're paying for Amazon Prime, right? They're paying for Hulu. But somehow here they are going into an industry that desperately needs sources of revenue, and they're cheating and not paying. So if they're not getting it, no one's getting it. So that's really it. First of all, we need to change the idea and have people in philanthropy know journalism should be is part of philanthropy. It cannot survive using the old model. So philanthropy needs to be part of the solution, not just as a quick fix, but in an ongoing way. And that if we don't do that, really our democracy is compromised. And that should be of concern to everybody.
One last question, come on. Students go first.
Hi, my name is Iman. I'm a PhD student at the Lilly School. So regarding polarization and the comment mentioned about how the policy sector is actually reflective of the culture and it's a two-way street. So some of our students are trying to perceive philanthropy's role in a more subversive manner towards existing systems. So are you as positive or as pessimist as things go? Because aside from funding and collaborative processes, we do have a more moral duty perhaps to be advocates. And I see philanthropy to, subvert existing status quo, right?
Yes.
So how do you see, or what advice you have for students like us who are, beginning in this field in such times?
Great question, about whether students, people entering the field have a option or duty to be subversive, to upset and do something counter to the status quo.
So that's a great question. I'm glad you asked it, and I'm glad you're committed to making change happen. I think that if you step back and look at the history of philanthropy in many places in the world over different times, it kind of goes in waves, where in some periods philanthropy really seems to be supporting the status quo and making, hardwiring that system even more. And in other times, it is able to be much more of an agent for change and justice. I think that in the current era, it's important to be especially careful in trying to make sure that you are able to communicate with people beyond the circle who already agree. And that this is, again, part of what's happening in many, many places. Just, taking the Gaza, Palestine example. I don't think any of these counter-protesting groups are actually listening to one another, right? So how, if you want to make change happen, how do you not just create your messages for those people who see the world as you do, but how do you bring other people in? And then how do you authentically listen to them? Because it can't just be one way, right?
I think too, it really depends on what the issue or the problem is, but I'll tell you a brief story if you want, that might be helpful. Back in the 60s, there was a group of religious leaders in Fairbanks, second biggest city where I live, who went to see Elmer Rasmussen, the banker, and asked him to donate money so that a well-known artist in Alaska could paint a mural of the original missionaries who came to Alaska. And his mother was one of them with the Evangelical Covenant Church, came from Sweden. So he said yes. And it's a beautiful, big mural, like as big as those windows there. And it's very colorful, and it's a well-known artist who people will know who painted that as soon as they see it, if they live in Alaska, likely. But when I would walk into the Rasmussen Library and see that, something always really bothered me about it, which was Jenny Olson Rasmussen was standing there, almost like the Statue of Liberty, with these Native people all around her in a row, looking like the Great White Hope. And it bugged me every time I didn't go in there that often, but I'd see it, it just kind of, anyway, it was done at a certain time, right? It was based on a book and so on. Well, I'm going to say 6-7 years ago, a student at the University of Alaska Fairbanks started a protest about the mural. And I learned about it on Facebook, and I thought, oh boy, so I better get ahead of this one, right? But I agreed with her pretty much. So I found an intermediary who she trusted in her community of Kotzebue, so the Nupiat Eskimo women, and we got on the phone, and she was very upset. I asked her a couple of questions. She was crying. And what I said was, listen, a couple of things. Number one, we're talking about a piece of art. People have different opinions. I don't believe in destroying art. I just don't. Some of the most impactful art for me has been a very, very upsetting images. I don't think it should be destroyed, but it can't be displayed with no explanation. And number two, just to, the people who did this didn't have any bad intentions when they did it. they're basically good people. They have very warm relationships with your community, all the rest. Is it possible for you to put aside your anger for a moment, and I totally get it because I agree with you, and see, could we make something positive come out of this? Anyway, without going into the long detail, we ended up, the mural was removed and moved. And then we did a contest to create a new mural depicting the Alaska Native community, which went up. I never told Ed Rasmussen this was going on. I told his sister, because I just thought, I didn't know how he would take it. And I wanted to solve it. But I also was told by a group of colleagues, we were in this diversity equity group study, this is not your problem, this is the university's problem. They're shifting it onto you. It's a university piece of art in a university building with university students. Force them to solve it and have a community discussion about it and get the faculty, make it, this is what universities do. So it all had a happy ending. I'm sure it could have gone the other way because she was a reasonable young woman and I wanted a happy outcome, and we found an artist and it just all worked. We were lucky, I would say, in part. But in that particular case, that was possible. It isn't always at all. But sometimes if you can find the common ground, which you hope you can't always. Sometimes it moves the agenda, sometimes you can't. But that's kind of how I've played it personally, where I try and have that kind of an outcome.
Before we thank Melissa and Diane for their wonderful comments, let me ask them to conclude by giving us some advice in terms of what they hope we will be achieving with these conversations that we have begun on philanthropy and policy.
So I'm very excited for this series, and I see this also as an opportunity to start to think differently about the role of a university in public life and in being a bridge across different kinds of organizations and sectors, and as a place that holds ideas, sometimes conflicting ideas, but can hold them and can hold them with a community.
I just see such an opportunity with this program to help the philanthropy sector figure some of these hard questions out, because there's a lot of need for knowledge. There's a lot of need for discussion that doesn't always happen on difficult topics. And I think where you can play a huge role is in that you know how to do research and collect data and publish it and write it in a way that people can read it and understand it. And then more going into the area of working with practitioners as well, I think just offers a great, great tool for the whole sector that I look forward to seeing how it develops. So.
Thank you both for a wonderful, lively conversation, and please join me with one more hand of applause for our wonderful guests. Thank you so much. And thank you for being with us in this room and online, and please stay tuned for future conversations on this topic throughout the year. Have a good evening.